Welcome to the Longest Day podcast. I'm Leah, your host and the founder of Broadstairs Consulting. We are an advisory and mediation consultancy, bringing clarity, focus, and momentum to organizations by helping leaders find creative solutions that work. We help rebuild relationships and facilitate effective dialogue. We are convinced that people matter and that conversations count, so we started The Longest Day, a series of conversations where we learn from the resilience, determination, and candor of our guests. As they look back on their longest days, our hope is that it will empower you to look forward. We hope their stories will be a part of shaping yours. This week on The Longest Day, we welcome Professor Lucy Easthope, the UK's leading authority on recovering from disaster. She's been an advisor on nearly every major disaster of the past 2 decades and has travelled across the world in her unique role, seeing the very worst that people have to endure. Lucy has a degree in law, a PhD in medicine, and a master's in risk, crisis, and disaster management. She is also Professor in Practice of Risk and Hazard at the University of Durham and Fellow in Mass Fatalities and Pandemics at the Centre for Death and Society at the University of Bath. Her memoir, When the Dust Settles, Stories of Love, Loss, and Hope from an Expert in Disaster, was released in March 2022 and was a Sunday Times bestseller. Described as a book that lifts us up, showing that humanity, hope, and humour can and must be found on the darkest days, I think it's clear why Lucy is a perfect guest for The Longest Day. Well, Lucy, thank you so much for being willing to come on The Longest Day. I wonder if you might like to tell our listeners about your longest day.
Oh, thank you very much for having me. Well, I've given this some thought because a lot of my emergency response days are quite long. I'm an emergency planner, and we sometimes get calls very out of hours. And I think, ironically, some of the earliest very long days I did was slightly before my career in disaster response, which only gets a few lines in my memoir, but it was actually working in television, which is these sort of horrific expectations of what people often say, does disaster response prepare you for anything? And it was like more like bosses in television prepare you to do anything. And what I've learned much more than in disaster management, in TV, you never say no. So if you had to have something for your boss the next morning, you did not go to bed. So the second longest day, I think, would be in emergency response. And actually the longest sort of psychological days were probably those that I write about in the book, waiting for the invasion of Iraq. And I'm based at the mortuary that we've built at the at Brize Norton, the RAF base, and you're waiting for something to unfold. And I write in When the Dust Settles about getting ready and rehearsing, and then eventually you turn the news on and the soldiers have started to die. And that was probably both logistically very long days. We rehearsed at night, so 3 and 4 a.m. But also, I think that's the moment I shed skins a lot of the time, and an old me dies and a new me is born, and a new me was born in March 2003. And then that's kind of followed me through my career, really, that there's been these nights, always at night, isn't it? The longest night rather than the longest day, where events you realise have so changed you that you're kind of reborn out of those, I think.
We know that the waiting in your longest day did come to an end. How did your longest day and many of the events that you have responded to since then change your relationship with waiting?
Oh, well, I remember addressing that very early on when I was asked to train up a new member of staff. I'd never been asked to do that before. And I didn't know that you had to approach it like in a management or HR way. I approached it in like I had a little sister way, which there's HR directors all over the world grabbing their heads in horror. I was like, I've got a new friend. She's my new friend. So rather than sort of show where the printer was, I was like, yay, come and hang out with me. And so I don't think I told her anything useful, but what I remember is, I got out this elaborate, that particular day I'd packed a lunch, and I got out at lunch and made sure she had some food. And she said, what are you doing? This isn't a disaster response firm. It's all very intense and busy. I said, yes, but today is a quiet day. And it was about 4 days before we deployed to Brize Norton. We'd done all the planning and we were going to go and live in Brize Norton. And I said, what these older men and women have taught me around me is the value of fallow. And that has stayed with me. If you have a quiet afternoon, you use that very well. And that might mean, first and foremost, that might mean rest. But to value the fallow. So I never wait for anything, genuinely. And that was also a lesson in my sort of personal life, because I've only managed to have 2 babies, but I've been pregnant many times, is you transform the idea of waiting to fallow, and also as to highly valuable, precious resource building time. And that's really important. Patience is such a underrated virtue. And even I think as more and more people are starting to get to grips with their own attention deficit or their hyperactivity, both of which I understand very deeply, to forcibly and physically practice patience and deliberately deprive yourself of saying, I will not do that today. And one of the things people sometimes, it might come as a tease or it might come as a genuine question. I might, put up a tweet, I might put up several tweets, but I won't necessarily reply to an email. That will be in a later time, on a schedule that's different. And that's something we haven't really addressed. And I find myself doing that more and more in mentoring, telling somebody to wait.
What was the fruit of the waiting on your longest day?
It's the worst kind of fruit. You just didn't want that. One of the worst things about being an emergency planner is you never want your plan to you want it to work, but you never want it to be needed. So you didn't want to see a single casualty from the invasion of Iraq. That would have been ideal, that we packed up and that we went home. And that's never left me as a feeling. I, as well as a disaster planner, as I often say, I put a lot of effort into being a pandemic planner, and to see these things come to reality is one of the hardest aspects of our work. We would much rather stay as slightly unusual fantasists, I think. And I see that weariness in a lot of colleagues. We're getting righter and we're getting more needed. And that's very hard sometimes. We're generally spot on with our scenario planning, and then you just wait for it to become the grim reality. And every aspect of the plan came to be needed in Bryce Norton. There was a plan for the deceased soldiers. There was a plan for the men and women bringing them back. There was a plan for the bereaved families. There was a plan for viewing of their loved ones. There was a plan to bring the coffins off the Hercules. Everything was planned and everything was needed. And that was the ultimate result of that longest day.
But sometimes there are disasters that don't have a plan. What is it about your career to date that has made you able to deploy the same resilience, mettle, strength of character as when you have a plan, to where there isn't a plan and you're called in to help?
Well, I think firstly, in a lot of things now, people don't realise how much work we do behind the scenes. So that I think the example there probably would be more related to there's these very formal plans sometimes that get thrown out the window. But one of the bigger tests, I think, particularly once you start advertising yourself as being able to do this, is what if those things start to hit closer to home. So when, say, a family member's seriously ill, or when a crisis hits close to home, close to the neighbourhood. And that was very important to me with the pandemic. I write about the first place really that I went to once I'd done some initial planning work was to check that my local village was all right, to check that the headmaster had a plan for my children's school. So there's a thing about both the plans that you work very hard for, and then the things that sort of take you. I wouldn't say I'm taken by surprise, but the things that you wouldn't be expected to sit down with your family and work out a plan for when grandma goes into hospital. But I think the other thing is you see these things all around the world. Countries have tsunami plans, or they'll have earthquake plans, and you see some wonderful commonalities of human behaviour. So in a way, the plan almost plays catch up wherever you are in the world. One of the things recently, I was caught up in some very bad weather, and of all things, a very British village cake and dog show, and suddenly the heavens opened, and it felt like a cyclone. I'm not sure North Wales gets many of those, but it felt like that. And everybody was sort of briefly paralysed against all of the research that we do that nobody panics. But one of the things I noticed people were trying to do was trying to protect the stalls and protect the cakes and protect each other, but in situ. And there was a very hard standing building nearby. And I was shouting at people to go to the hard standing building. And I spoke to some of them later, and they said, when you did that, it gave us permission to move. And I'm not a responder. I've never been an emergency responder. I'm an emergency planner, and I come in afterwards. But it did teach me a lot about perhaps the value of not being afraid of the surprise in those moments. I don't want to have to test this too many times, but I seem to be able to overcome a startle factor quite quickly that I think some people are quite paralysed by initially. That's what I've noticed. I watch a lot of people stand and watch things, whether that's an incident on the train or something. I think that's perfectly understandable. And it's probably more a kind of consequence of living in a country where we expect help to come from somewhere else. And I think there's a wonderful, empowering thought in working on the principle that we are the help.
Are you feeling stuck? Has conflict got you down? Have you considered mediation? Mediation is a confidential and flexible way to resolve conflicts. 86% of all mediations end in a solution, saving time, money, and stress for all involved. Thanet Mediation Centre, a Broadstairs consulting initiative, offers mediation services to individuals and organisations in Thanet, Kent, and further afield. For more information or advice, email us at info@broadstairsconsulting.com. We are here to help you move forwards.
Any person's career can be enhanced by training, but it seems to me that where there is aptitude and passion behind a vocation, that has been prompted from something. What is it in your life to date that has made you able to work so well in these environments and to do your job with such proficiency?
I'm smiling partly because I'm not sure I ever really achieve either. And I don't mean to be, that's not me being self-deprecating. I think sometimes my field is a great way to hide your other incompetencies. I had a colleague once who said, the great thing about you, Lucy, is when you break the photocopier, nobody notices because the worst has happened outside the window. So, I think sometimes let's not overstate the abilities here, but I do think that there's a few things that actually probably don't come from the work but came from home, and I've thought about that a lot more really as a wider sort of kin, as a family group, particularly on my dad's side. There's a very strong Methodist faith. There's a very strong I never grew up with the idea that you helped your neighbour. I grew up with the idea that everybody was your neighbour. So you absolutely helped everybody. And then it was only when I got to about 19, 20 and I realised that other people saw that as quite interfering or abusive. Or, what are you doing force feeding me cake and offering me a clean set of clothes? And I'd grown up amongst incredible generosity. And it was only when I saw that through another lens that I realised that was not always normal. And also as I've written about and I tweet about a lot, a culture of many of the female matriarchs in the family were teachers. And I think one of the things about teachers is that they're sort of never off duty in a way, particularly if they're very passionate about their subject. And we turn it into a lot of jokes. But if somebody said, I'd really like to be a brain surgeon, rather than just go, that's interesting, my mum would go and get the pamphlets on how to be a brain surgeon, and they would do all of these kind of pieces of work for you, and they'd find the web links. And I was being interviewed by a student yesterday, and I followed up with a load of things, and they commented that people aren't always that helpful. I never really considered it as anything over and above. So when this sort of passion hit me, and it did hit me, and it hit me young. I was 10 when I decided this was the area I was going to work in. I wanted to give it my all, really. And I'm never finished learning about this field, really, I would say.
Who has encouraged you in your pursuits of this field?
Oh, well, I smile because that 10-year-old, did nobody think it was a bit bonkers? I mean, I find it really emotional with the Beatles song Now and Then, it's all because of you, my mum and my dad and my little sister. And then later on, and it's something I write about, I think although I often didn't take work home and talk to my husband Tom about it too much, he is the definitive kind of, he's the reason to go home at the end of a dark day. And what one person who'd read the book came back to me and said, the only reason I could work out that you were able to do this is that you were going home to such love and such light. I never take that for granted, by the way. And I'm not saying there'll be no marital advice from me. He may have a very different story to tell, but I think you do need that light. And I was really pleased that the way people have responded to the book, they're not thinking that I'm shutting Tom out. They're realizing that there has to be two worlds. And I think that's very true. I was responding the other day to the drama about the post office scandal that we've had here in the UK. And one of the portrayals I find most powerful is the wife of the campaigner. The wind between somebody's wings, but also the person that says, that's enough now. Great kind of sources of support that make you turn the email off. And I think I'm quite envious sometimes of people who aren't this vexated or concerned with things, because it sometimes can feel like your kind of switchboards on your brain of the solder is burnt out, and to have people around you that go enough is incredibly important, I think.
What advice would you give to somebody who, I can't imagine we have any 10-year-olds listening to this podcast, but I suppose someone in their teenage years who has a vision for what they want to do and everyone around them thinks it's crazy? What would you say to them in pursuit of that?
Well, it's an interesting one because, I don't want to encourage kind of complete sort of narrow blindness and ignoring of the advice of others. I know I certainly left my career as teachers a little bit confused, and as is a very good choice, they recommended law, which I took them up on, and I would not be without my law degree. I knew I didn't want to practice, although that could sort of make some of the events and summer placements and internships quite hard, because I was very much an outlier doing different things and heading off to do research on the Hillsborough disaster and all those kind of things. But I very, very, very pleased I took that path. What I would say is you really need, however young you are, and I see this in my own two little ones, you need to get a very good sense of you very early on. I was very lucky because I was so bad at so many things. I've been asked this week, I'm still chuckling about it. I've been asked to go and give a motivational talk to a sports team, and it's still blown my mind. And I think I'm going to open it with the discussion that the first time I attempted to play in my school lacrosse team, I was actually hit on the back of the head by the ball as I ran away because, this was clearly a silly idea. And I was so bad at sports and I was so bad at science. And I'm much better at maths now. Running your own business does help you with your maths, but I was bad at maths and I get so mono-focused. I was obsessed at school with disasters in the Second World War and the First Gulf War and all these kind of things. And I'd overanalyze friendships and all those things. And so when I got to 16 and you're starting to pick your options, I actually wasn't good at so many things. And I'm quite glad I wasn't a generalist. And I think one of the things, that we perhaps need to do more with younger people is articulate what they're not and what they are. I think the other thing is, for me, a university path alongside a very practical response path has worked. But I'm the daughter of a carpenter. And one of the things that I think is a really great balance is to help young people find either, sports or arts or practical trades or skills that bring them joy. And there's just not enough space for that in the environment that we have at the moment. And that's my biggest aim. And it's such a responsibility, actually. I've just become the chair of a children's charity that responds at the base of the Grenfell Tower. And we have a young girls group and we have a futurehood group. And most of those young women want to be Prime Minister. And that's exactly what I'd love them to be. So it's just making sure they have all the skills and the access and the opportunities that they should have to do that.
There are many people in our society who have, in that sense, slipped through the net. So they find themselves in their early 30s and they are still struggling with their own identity or a lack of encouragement and a lack of support. With your mentoring hat on, how would you encourage them to press into themselves, to understand where their strengths are and to help them find their purpose?
Well, I think that's a wonderful thing that runs through the privilege that is my work, that life is so incredibly fragile. You literally only have today. And anything else is a gift and a bonus. And I think there's something about my work that means, having seen, humans in their most fragile of forms, you realize, and not in a cynical way, and not in a trite way, and not in a you don't have an ISA or a pension way, but you start to realize, particularly I think when people agonize about themselves so much, just what an achievement it is, the circulatory system, the digestive system, you achieved the minute you woke up this morning. People really torture themselves. And I think one of the things that we're in a bit of a crisis about at the moment is not just sort of patting ourselves on the back for just kind of surviving and getting through. So that I do get quite sort of evangelical about the need to just really kind of go quite basic and think you're doing great today. I think the other thing is, on that note, is to sort of invest in yourself as an idea. So looking after yourself, and I'm a really big fan. When I started in my career, I was very well, and in fact spoke to one last week, one of my colleagues from the beginning. It will, I'm sure, be there at the end, an American psychologist who's helped me all the way through my career. And what I found with the American crisis support was it was much more geared to looking after yourself as an individual. You cannot bring your A game burnt out. You have to rest. And the idea of what rest might look like. So for me, rest might look like I will watch 6 episodes of Selling Sunset. There will be cake. I mean, people, and do you know what? I decided I've got my professorship. I'm not going to hide that. I'm going to tweet all the way through that so people know exactly what I'm doing, because they've already seen me. They've seen me at the House of Lords that morning, or they've seen me somewhere else. And now I'm going to be really honest that this is my burnout prevention time. Or I might enjoy a nice meal, or you might see me watching something at the cinema. And so one of the things I made a conscious decision about was that people would see me recharging my batteries. I do walk, not very far, and I swim a little bit, not very fast. But that was the first thing, and that we're rubbish at. There's also a culture of busy, so kind of showing that we're very busy. And actually, people say to me, "You're so busy." I'm like, well, no, I just tweet a lot. They're 2 very different things. So I think one of the things is getting to know yourself and your strengths. I find very few people can say, and I remember years ago, Big Brother in one of the early editions made you organise yourselves in terms of who was the cleverest in the room or who was the most beautiful in the room. And there was a whole debate in Britain about, like, how would you ever be able to place yourself? And you have to be able to start describing yourself and your skills in a blurb way. You have to really understand what you're good at and what your skills are. I think a lot of modern life, a lot of appraisals, a lot of work is designed to break you down a bit. So remember those things, really. Just your cells all working this morning is enough for me. And the other thing is, I've seen a lot of not very peaceful deathbeds. I don't think any of that matters. And I think one of the things that's important is to judge yourself on, who you are in your soul is really important to me. And in the words of Shania Twain, I think some things that people think will impress me that don't impress me much. It's who you are.
Last question. If you had to live your longest day again, what food would you choose to fuel it?
Oh, that's a really difficult one, actually, because one thing I've learned is if I know I've got a really difficult day is I don't take my biggest sources of what we call kind of olfactory trauma and memories are things that I want to keep for comfort elsewhere. So those would be days where you've sort of got food for fuel, and often that's quite unhealthy in our field. It's the crisps and what we would have called then a marathon bar. But food as fuel. The best comfort food I've discovered, and there's a group of 5 women that I acknowledge in the book, in the acknowledgements, that got me through really some of the darkest times after Grenfell. And my staple with them was sourdough and avocado. It is ruining the rainforest, and it's very millennial of me, but we would go to a cafe and we'd just talk about lovely, fun things we wouldn't talk about. They weren't in my field. We wouldn't talk about work. We'd talk about our babies and we'd talk about that. And it was a sourdough and avocado and eggs and hot chocolate. So I would save that and have it after my longest day.
I'm a millennial. I love that. I'm biased. I accept that. But I'm also so thankful for you taking time to share a snippet of your experiences and some of the insights in When the Dust Settles with us. And thank you again for coming on the longest day.
Thank you for having me.
You've been listening to a Broadstairs Consulting Limited podcast. We hope you've enjoyed this episode. Tune in soon to hear the next instalment of The Longest Day. Copyright 2024, production copyright Broadstairs Consulting Limited, all rights reserved.